So today we're going to be looking at the parish of UIG in the county of Ross and Cromarty. And it's a very interesting parish, a quite isolated and unique parish, really, in that it has so many things that were there for a long time before that. The research has been done by Marguerite Teska, who lives in Leesburg, Virginia. She pointed out in her preparation notes that her first name is French and her surname is Polish, but that doesn't mean that her ancestor was not from this parish. He came from this parish, and Marguerite has been a huge help to our group that's looking at Bruce County in Ontario, documenting all the families there. That Kathy and Catherine and myself and Marguerite are working to get all the people, all the McLennans who went to that part of the world into the clan records. And I would say Kathy particularly is doing a fantastic job getting those people in. So thank you to Kathy too. But Marguerite's part of that group. And she herself is she was born in New York, grew up in South Carolina, went to college in the Carolinas and in Georgia, and now lives in Virginia, brought up 2 sons, looks after horses in her spare time when she's not doing genealogy. So we're going to look at these aspects. We're going to use the old statistical account as usual and some other resources to try and better understand what was everyday life like for people who lived in this part of the world in the 1790s. And things that will affect that will be the topography of the parish, where it is in relation to other places, what sort of prehistory they had, what the living condition. We're going to look at the living conditions, the number of people, the sort of agriculture they can carry on there, and other means of sustenance, schools, ministers, and a few McLennans who live in that parish. So here's the first page of the old statistical account, written by Hugh Munro, the minister. He'd been a minister there for about 16 or so years when he wrote this account. So he knew the people quite well. He came from the Hebrides himself. His father was a minister in South Uist. And so, you know, he's familiar with this part of the world and how it works. There's a bit of doubt about whether it really was 1797 that he wrote this account. That's when it says so in the Adena site. But in fact, in the document itself, it says last year in 1794, blah, 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 somewhere. So it makes us think that, you know, maybe it was written in 1795, but it's a bit academic whether it was 95 or 97, right, for our purpose. The other thing that we see here is that in the statistical account, he describes the place as being named for the situation of the parish as being separated from, I'll just turn the pointer on, separated from, where was I looking at that? Separated from the parish of Stornoway and Locks, which lie much further away. He says that the name comes from it being an isolated, remote place. That's the sort of phrases that he uses. But in fact, we know now that that's not the basis, although it's incredibly true that it was a remote place where they lived. So maybe it's a good fault that he fell into by giving it that name. We know now that the name UIG is just a corruption of the spelling Vik, V-I-K, the Norse word meaning a bay, or, you know, like a waterway, a place to bring your boat in. Quite an important thing if you're a Viking. Norse, let's call them to be polite. And there is this large bay called Loch Rogue on the Atlantic side of Lewis there. It's such a huge thing that you can see it when you're a long way, you know, got a very distant view of the island. So that's where it gets the name. A lot of these places there have names of Norse origin. And these are just a few of the sort of names that you get coming in there, like the one we just looked at. Vik or Uig is a bay, or, you know, a loch or a waterway that you can park your boat in. And other names that you see here. If you see that ending on a word AY, that tells you it's a island, and other things. Many Norse elements are in names, you know, like Kirk is a Norse word, surprisingly. You think of it as a Scots word, but that's what it is. In fact, the name Hebrides itself is a bit in doubt about its origins, but it seems to be a Norse word that means islands on the edge of the sea, which of course it is in a way. The whole of the Hebrides are islands on the edge of the Atlantic. Not your side of the Atlantic, I know, but on the eastern side. Now, there are many different spellings for all these places. You've got to be a bit adaptable, a bit like, you know, whether you've got MAC and MC in the McLennans. Don't be too hard and fast. Many variants of the place names, but some of them, of course, are the Gaelic and the English versions of the same place. You know, like even take the second one there. It's really like the English uses the Gaelic version, but just takes the spaces out. And even in the Gaelic, you often see it written with no spaces. So, you know, that's the sort of thing you get. This mean, you know, we know this sort of name, don't we? We've seen this when we looked at the parish of Lochs, which adjoins the parish we're looking at today. We saw a place, Pam, called Bal Allen, and it just means like the place of the Allen family or the Allens. And the place or the village is this element of it. And so in this case, this is the word like kill, you know, like Kilmorack and so on, like a monastery or a cell, you know, monastic cell. That's a word we would use in English. And that's the same thing there. So there's this place, which is where the church actually is. You'd be surprised to hear in this time. And again, you've got this sort of thing. These are the Gaelic spellings. And of course, out in the Hebrides, increasingly, you see the Gaelic spelling being given priority over the English spelling, you know, on the road signs and so on. You see the Gaelic spelling before you see the English. So on maps, it's the same, you know, it's increasingly the Gaelic place names are being used rather than the, and so here's this word bay, you see there, look at that. Pub is a word for priest, apparently, and then AY at the end means the bay of the island of the priests. I don't know about reef and those, but you know, that's the other one. This is another place you'll see a lot of, Valtos. You know, it's spelled in the Gaelic, it's spelled that way. So on a map, you might well see it spelled that way. You know, we're talking about that one. Okay, so be a bit open-minded about spelling is part of the game. So where are these islands we're talking about, this part of the world we're talking about? I laugh at this map. I think it's so funny because, you know, this is an overview to show you where the Hebrides are in relation to the bulk of Scotland. But the funny thing about the map for me is that this is such an enlightenment thing that they're calling it Scotland or North Britain, Kathy. You remember, we had this discussion. NB, there it is on the map, North Britain. And, you know, this was very much a thing of the times, you know, the 1700s. This map is from 1798, the very time we're talking about, when these folk from, you know, Edinburgh and whatnot were very keen to distance themselves from the ruffians who lived to their north and wanted to be seen as being just another part of Britain and part of this sort of, you know, new wave of thinking. The end of the modern world. They wanted to be thought of as people from the modern world, not the ancient world. So they called themselves North Britain. There you go. And here are the Hebrides out here, separated by this waterway called the Minch in here. And this is Skye, of course, here. And this is the inner Hebrides down here. And this is the outer Hebrides, which includes Harris and the Uists and Benbecula, if you like to. And up here you've got the Lewis. And of course, the Isle of Lewis is not really an island. That's just another Scottish trick, because part of it is Harris. And even that is connected to the south part of Harris via the very narrow Tarbet Peninsula, isthmus. And another trick with this is that there's a UIG parish, excuse me. There's an UIG on Skye here. And actually, it's one way to get out to the Hebrides. You can go to UIG and catch a ferry across to the northern part, the North Uist, and get to the Hebrides that way. A more normal way would be to go from Ullapool across to Stornoway. Yeah. So we're looking at this group of things in the North Island in the orange box here, and this is looking in a bit more detail. I just want to show you this map to start with, because here you've got the island, the whole of Lewis, the Isle of Lewis, and this is Harris. You can see it's actually got quite a long land border, North Harris with Lewis. We know this, we've seen this before, this parish here, Lochs. You remember we had a session about that earlier. And we've got this Loch Seaforth here, which has got the T shape of it. And then it goes up to Stornoway, which has this protruding piece coming out. We see it over there as well. And but UIG is in this quarter of Lewis. And you can see this great bay that it's named for comes quite a way inland to almost to the boundary over here with Lochs Parish. So that's where UIG is. And here's a map. This is a bit, they didn't have the benefit of satellite photography to make this one. Obviously, it's not that similar, is it? You look at the different shapes, they're pretty different. Roughly the same, but pretty different. So there you go. And here you won't see these again, but here we've got what's called Flannel Islands there, but actually it's got a double N usually. They're out to sea, and you'll see some pictures of those later, but this is the only time you'll see them on a map. Now, to complicate things for you a little bit, that this area in here, this area, and up here a bit, in the time we're talking about was not like this. This is a boundary after the 1890s. This area with the orange box around it in the 1790s was a part of Lochs Parish over here. But we're going to just treat it for our purpose as it was in the boundary after 1889. 1889, not 90s. Yeah. 1889. So that's called Carloway. That's a name you'll hear a bit of, this word here, Carloway. That became divided up into between the two parishes either side, to UIG on the south and to Barvis on the north. We're not going to do Barvis in our coverage. Not many McLennans live there. Now, here's this, pay attention, please, because this is some of the places that will be on the exam for sure. I'm not telling you which ones will be on the exam yet, but you know, so most of these, many of them will be. This is the map that's rather a funny map, you know, that comes with the statistical account. You can see here some of the places. So should we start with Great Bernera? That's that island that's right in the middle of the loch. Now the loch is this whole area here right over. Sometimes they talk about east and west of Loch Roig, but we're going to, it's just one loch mainly. And starting up here, we've got Carloway that we talked about a minute ago. We've got Callanish, where the famous stones are, some of the most amazing things in the world. We've got Kirkybost here, where quite a few McLennans lived on Great Bernera. And you've got up here, this place, Croyer. You've also got a place here, Boster. You see that little bay there? Boster, that's it there. We saw that on the place names earlier. And then over here, you've got this piece of land that sticks out here is known as the Valtos Peninsula. And on it, you have places like Reef, Cliff, and Neep. They're some of the places, and Valtos itself, but it's known as the Valtos Peninsula. And then over here, you've got an area called Sands of UIG, or the Bay of UIG there, or UIG Bay. And this is the sands in here. And that's where you find the church. This is the name of the church. We talked about it earlier, Balnasile, and that's where it is. So these are the main places. This one I've saved to last because it sort of became the administrative place. So when the post office came, that's where the post office was set up. But really there's no capital really in a way. I mean, it's a sort of people are much spread around. Many of the McLennans lived here on this Valtos Peninsula. That's where we find many of them. And many of these people went to Canada, to particularly Western Ontario. And then from there to the world. There's a place I haven't mentioned yet, and that's called Little Burnery. The Little Burnery. You can see it written on that that island up there, and there are a number of other islands here in the loch. This is just the broad view of the topography. You've got here the Great Bernera, you've got the UIG Bay here that we talked about before, Callanish here. Look at how many inland lakes there are, lochs, freshwater lochs, so many. It's so sort of wet and boggy and damp. And in the southern side, you've got this is the Loch Resort that separates Harris from Lewis. And you've got more hills down here, hills. Remember, these were called the Forest of Harris, but it has no trees, the forest. It's a word they seem to use out in that part of the world. For a forest seems to be a place where the gentry can go hunting rather than a place that has trees. And they use the same terms up here. These are not got trees either. So you can see the different aspects here. And this is quite a raised up area here. So looking at the road across from Stornoway to Callanish, say, towards UIG, you come along this long area in here, and you'll see that there are no, even on the Google Distant Map, there's no places mentioned here. It has got that Ballallam there, you see, that I mentioned earlier. That's part of this Lochs parish that we dealt with previously. Anyway, I want you to look at this X on the road here, because the next picture I'm going to show you is taken from that spot. It's not my photo, although I remember it vividly, but it's a Google Street View. So Google Street View, you see, this is what it looks like. I could show you lots of pictures of coastline and rocks and little hills on the side, on the edges, but this is the great bulk of the land in the middle there. So looking back here now again, all the way across from here to here is all this sort of terrain, this flat, unused, no fences, you see. The only trees are telegraph poles. And there are a few trees way in the distance, but they're plantation trees. They're not, and the minister actually says in the old statistical account, there are no trees to be seen. Now that gives you a clue, doesn't it? I just took that from Street View. Again, here's the topographic map showing you some of the things that we've got there. And here's Loch Resort, the bottom of our parish that we're looking at today. Here's Great Bernera, and the boundaries up here now, and here's lochs over here. So this area in the middle here is generally peat moss moors. You know, it's just good for digging up peat. There are some high hills as you come down towards the southern side, but they're not that high. This is showing you how rocky it is. Look how rocky that is. And really the point of showing you this aerial photo from Google is to look at just how few the places are that you can do agriculture. A little bit along here, maybe, a little bit in here, a little bit in here, you know, little bits up here, just little bits, that's good. And little bits in here, that's it. This is all useless. Well, pretty much, not all. And there are some of the places, you know, I mentioned Boster earlier, Carlaway up here, Callanish here, these are the places. All these places will certainly be on the exam. And this is what's called the sands of UIG here in this bay. So then looking at, I'm going now to up to the north here, Boster, right? This little white patch, you see that little bit of sand there? This is showing you what the coastline looks like. I've shown you the inland. This is what the coastline looks like. The red dot doesn't belong there. And a few purposes in showing you this one. It shows you the sort of the sand, which is not really sand in a traditional sense. It's small shells. So it's useful for putting lime onto crops and so on. This sand, it's not just broken down rock as such. It's small shells that can be used, and that explains why you have these flowers and so on along what this in this part of the world is called the macaire, or macaire. I haven't quite got the pronunciation right, but that's how I say it. And this also shows that humans have lived here for an extraordinarily long time. In 1992, a gale unearthed a village, really, houses that dated from the Iron Age or Pictish times, about 400 to 800 AD, these buildings were. And they're underneath the sands that were revealed. They've since done archaeology on them and then covered them in again, but they built one here that is a reproduction of what they found. This is my photo, this one. I can tell that because this is my wife here, you see in the picture. She's not smiling. I don't know if she's smiling or not, I can't tell. Anyway, and the more or less the houses that were there in 1790s were the same as the houses that were there in 400 to 800 AD. They had the thatch roof, they had the stone walls, they had the hearth that still was there in these houses that were uncovered in the middle of the room with no chimneys. You know, all much the same as we know about these places. The only difference that was significant is that they think these houses were partly in the ground, that the walls of the house didn't come much above the surface. They were in the ground. That's why you see what you see there like that, that the walls are in the ground. And I might explain why they don't generally have windows in the houses either, apart from not having glass and being a bit windy. So it's a very similar thing to what we see in the 1790s. Even in the 1900s, they had these sort of houses in this part of the world. And they found, you know, quern stones, meaning the stones that are used to grind the flour, shells and so on that had been collected and eaten. And in fact, they had quite a good diet, these people, they think, because of the variety of things they ate. You know, all sorts of animals and shellfish and fish and so on. Okay, this map is looking mainly at the waterways and locks and so on. And it's showing you where the rivers come down. So this is a river coming down to the sands here. You've got Loch Resort here, which is the boundary we know. We've got this island out here called Miestra. We've got, as I said, the Red River, UIG Bay. Gallum Head is a feature of this, and this is a high part. This is called Laird of UIG here, meaning a high vantage point. Baltos is the peninsula here in the place. Parbay is an island that's there. We talked about that already. The islands are out to sea, 36 kilometres or so out to sea. I don't know what that is in the old money. Great Bernera, Little Bernera, and a lock in here for Carloway, and another lock down in here that feeds in, becomes Loch Rogue. And this is a waterway going into that lock. So you can, it doesn't actually say east and west there, but I mentioned that already. They look a bit funny, don't they, these schematic hills on these maps. This is a photo taken by a friend of mine who lives in Stornoway called Chris Murray. And it's obviously taken with a drone. And this is what the sands look like. You know, we saw that before, didn't we? What it looks like. This is now an actual photo showing you another variation, the fine white shell sand on the beach, and more hills on the western side. Someone who was in the meeting yesterday had spent some time staying here, and this name here, Ardroyal, is used now for a number of places that had their own names previously, and they now have Ardroyal 1, Ardroyal 2, that sort of thing, instead of the names that we're going to call them in our meeting today. So there's another thing. This is the islands I talked about. I said I'd show you some islands, a picture of the islands, and look at them. Look how amazing they are. Look at the height of the cliffs. You've got to scramble up to get to the top. The statistical account tells us that a family of Macaulays had sheep out there all year round. Imagine the poor bloody sheep. Not many places to hide there when the gales come in, are there? Had sheep there, and they would go out once a year only to shear the sheep and climb. To get there, they'd climb up the cliffs and shear the sheep. While they were there, they would also collect birds for eating and birds for feathers from the cliff sides by climbing up and down the cliffs. Well, one of those books, Black House or something about Lewis Man, the Peter May books have an incident where a person falls from a cliff collecting birds' eggs. Any of you read those books? No? Yeah, they're good. Anyway, so it wasn't until the 1890s that they put this staircase in there, so you could go up and down the staircase rather than having to scramble up the rock side. And the lighthouse wasn't built until 1899, so well after the period we're dealing with. Harbay Island is noted for its religious importance. You know, it had monks living there. In fact, that's why that's its name. It means Island of the Monks. So since we know that AY means island, we know that this part means monks. And it's in, we saw before several times where it is in the Loch Rogue, near the Valtos Peninsula, misspelt there. There are many other remains of chapels in other parts of the parish, both on islands, like the ones we saw a minute ago, like this island, and also on Little Bernera, Kirkibos, these other places. Laird, UIG, that's that heights I described to you near the Valtos Peninsula there. UIG Bay, you know that now. Mielstra, we saw that on the map earlier. So these are places now you're getting more familiar with. So you'll be prepared. I'm preparing you for the exam, okay? Looking at where there's such a lot of evidence of humans living in this part of the world from before many of the pyramids were built. It's there, like to be seen in person. We're going to look at the Callanish stones. We're going to look at Dun Carloway, an Iron Age Brock 2,000 years old, roundhouse at Neep, early chapels in the 1500 years ago, some Norse mills on Bernera that are like up to 800 years old, hugely thing. Look at the Lewis chessmen, and we're going to look at shieldings on Great Bernera. So I'll hand over to Stephen, who's offered to help with this presentation today, to talk with you about the Callanish stones.
Thanks, Bruce. The first thing I want to say is that Marguerite did a magnificent job with the research, and when Bruce sent me the notes, they were very comprehensive, and I learned a lot just reading from her notes. So hats off to Marguerite for the work that she put into this. The Callanish stones are some of the oldest structures on the Isle of Lewis, and they form a stone circle and with standing stones, and they were found in Callanish, but that area actually is very rich in many stone structures. The region or the area around there has a number of these, and there's several stone structures, stone circles, I should say, around Callanish, but also in the neighboring towns. There are several of these, and then there are several sites that have standing stones. And so while this one is of major significance, as I'll mention in a moment, and probably one of the largest, there were a number of these types of stone structures that are found on and around this parish. It was noted in the statistical account by Reverend Monroe that at a place called Callanish, not far from Loch Rogue, there's an entire druidical place of worship, of which I subjoin a sketch. The sketch is what's shown here on the slide that depicts the structure of the stone circle, and all of these were standing stones. Many of them were quite large, particularly the ones in the center of the circle. Go ahead and advance.
It's unusual to have any sketch in the statistical accounts, and they must have gone to great effort to make up a lead image of this to put into the statistical account.
Right, and I think if you take a snapshot of this in your mind, and then in the next couple of slides, we're going to see some actual pictures, you can see that he did quite a good job of detailing where the stones actually were. The stones seem to predate the Druids, which is circa 500 BC. When they were excavated in 1856, the peat moss surrounding them was 5 feet deep. Okay, so just thinking about what Bruce said, that there weren't any trees on the island, and subsequent dating has identified that this places those stones more than 4,000 years ago. Okay, which makes them as old or perhaps even older than some of the pyramids in Egypt. So that gives you a sense of how old these structures are. And number one, they're still standing. And number two, you're looking at the size of them and the placing on the long ends of the stones. This was quite a feat. And as I mentioned, there are several of these circles and what they call standing stones in the locality, in the region.
And that one, there's another one in the second picture.
Yes, yeah. Right. So of interest is that recently there's been a publication from the University of Adelaide that identifies that these stones are statistically proven that they're the earliest standing stone monuments in Britain. And of the great circles, they're constructed specifically in line with the movements of the sun and the moon. And in this report, they were indicating that it was 5,000 years ago. And even 2,000 years later in Scotland, much simpler monuments were still being constructed that are sort of based on this. But what is really of note here is that this study that was recently published identified that they're not just connected to the sun and the moon, but that they were actually constructed with the surrounding landscape and horizon. And so the detail and the emphasis of the engineering of this is quite phenomenal, particularly for the time and the age of when they're done. I think there's one more slide, is there?
Yeah, and there's this thing that these Neolithic peoples are perhaps associated with the Beaker people as opposed to the Celts who had been earlier settlers in Scotland. So this is a really, like Neolithic, it means that they're like farmers rather than hunter-gatherers, that the people who are thought to have built these stones.
So here's a nice image from the top, and you can see how it very nicely mirrors the sketch that Reverend Monroe provided. But there's a local folktale that the great standing stones on the Isle of Lewis were created by St. Kiernan from Ireland. And when he turned the giants to stone, Marguerite states, somehow I think the Druids are more likely, however. But even they are not early enough.
Yeah.
So the structure of the stone circle is about 13 meters in diameter, or about 43 feet, and it's situated just outside of the village of Callanish that Bruce had pointed out on the map. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Bruce.
We're going to talk then.
Stephen, could I ask a question?
You sure can. I don't know that I can answer, but I'd be happy to try.
Stephen, when you look at the center, there look to be four stones and quite a dip. Is that an old altar? Is it a grave?
Yeah. It's a burial. This is this spot here?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a burial hole, apparently.
And do we know what was buried there? Were they sacrificed or human, or
No,
we don't know?
I don't know. Somebody yesterday who's been there recently said it was a burial hole. I didn't ask them enough questions, Catherine, obviously.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Maybe there's gold coins at the bottom of the well.
it's pretty fascinating thing to go and see. You know, these are all things that you, when you go and make your trip, I hope you'll all go to Lewis now as a result of these, even if you don't have a direct family connection. It's a fascinating place. Orkney is a bit the same. You know, you have a similar structure there at Sturness on Orkney, and really old stuff there too. Maybe even older. And this predates Stonehenge, don't forget, by quite a number of centuries, I think. Okay, looking at going a bit further up the eastern side of Loch Rogue there to Carloway, you have up there one of these brocks. We've talked briefly about several brocks before, but this is a very good example of a brock that you have up there. They're thought that they were positioned strategically along the coast and that they could send signals from one to the other before there was 5G. They would send with smoke instead. And they would warn of, you know, approaching enemies and whatnot to each other and get ready rather than have to send a runner, which was a good thing. And this is known as Dun Carloway. And it's one of the best preserved of these. I'll show you a schematic of what the rest of it looked like in a little while. You see them quite, you know, like I remember seeing one just in Glenelg, just in the trees, you know, wasn't really any fuss made about it, just things planned, no great effort. There are quite a lot of them still. On Shetland, you see a lot too. And of course, they're more visible on places like Shetland and Lewis because there are no trees. They just stand out plainly to be seen. What's the difference between a dun, the word that's being used here, and the word that I used to describe it, brock? They're used often interchangeably, but really the word dun, it means like a fort more, and the word brock, it means more like one of these double-sided affairs like you see here. But that's a bit open to discussion too, you know. The words are used interchangeably. Dun is a Gaelic word and brock is a Norse word. There's that old conundrum there again for this part of the world. This is what they look like when they're up and running in use. If you wanted to order one from your local builder, this is what you have to give them, a plan like this. And you can see here the double wall and there's a staircase going up inside it. You know, you can see that in these today, although because they make a convenient quarry for building your own home. If you happen to setting up shop nearby, you just go and collect a few stones from your local brock and use them for your new house. And there's a roundhouse at Neep, which we'll see in a minute, that follows this same sort of pattern. You know, obviously it's better for smoke and things than the traditional black house.
Bruce, is that really allowed to take material from these?
I doubt it. Does that,
No.
did that worry people in the 1700s? I don't think so. They made whiskey too, you know. This is a place, remember we saw Neep there on the Valtos Peninsula, and this is thought to be a rather man-made island out there, and this little walkway across to it. Maybe it's just like been added to. Thought to be, you know, very old, 1,000 or 2,000, maybe 3,000 years old. It's you can see from this aerial view that it's a double-walled sort of brock-style building, and that there's this little walkway out to it. And nearby, Marguerite points out that there are 5 Norse mills, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is what that's thought to look like, the one on the island there at Neep. It's got like the causeway getting across has some barrier there. It's a typical brock style of building. And out here you've even got a few sheep and a separate briar for the sheep with their fence. It's pretty fancy. This one is sometimes called Dun Baravat, and the funny thing is there's another place exactly the same on the Great Bernera, just to trick you. There are 2 of the same name. Yeah. These Norse mills that I mentioned a second ago, see, they're all over the place in Lewis and in UIG in particular. A small beehive type building like you see here, this one. And it's put in a riverbed and the water is diverted through underneath the building and passes underneath. The characteristic of these Norse mills. And it's not because they were put there by Norse people. They're just known as that. They've probably been made after the Norse had left. Even these ones we're looking at here, they're not actually Norse. It's the style of them rather than the pedigree of them that we're talking about when we talk about Norse mills. On the, obviously a piece of timber goes down through the mill wheel you're trying to turn, the rock, the quern, and into the underneath. And the characteristic of it is that it's not like a paddle steamer water wheel. It's the stick has pieces off the bottom of it, so that the water passing by will turn the wheel going up to the top, like sort of rudders, you might say, poking off the side of the timber that goes down through the quern. Yeah, that's what it looks like. And this particular one was used until the 1920s. How good is that? And this is where you feed the grain in, of course. This is the hopper. So you put your unground grain up here, drop it in through the hole, water turns the wheel around, and before you know it, you've got yourself a bit of meal. Rolled oats, we call them. The Lewis chessmen, or as we're going to call them from here on, the UIG chessmen, don't forget, were discovered in 1831 very near sands of UIG. That's where they come from. And there have been quite a lot of them found. 11 of them are in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and others are in the BM in London, British Museum. They're thought to date from the 12th and 13th century and thought to have been made in a workshop in Trondheim in Norway. I've been to Trondheim, and the thing I remember about it is all the wood carvings. I guess this sort of carving stuff happened in long winter months, long dark winter months, by candlelight of some sort. But they're beautiful things, aren't they? One was recently auctioned at Christie's for more than $1 million. One for more than $1 million US. It's a lot, eh? And it's thought that the game wasn't actually chess as we know it today, where you have like First World War warfare with the kings and the king and queen and their pawns and so on advancing up and down through the field of play. It's thought that the powerful pieces sat in the middle, and that people attacked from the pieces attacked from 4 different sides simultaneously. A bit more like Viking warfare than First World War style. What do you think? And therefore they had more pieces, because they had this 7 pieces or something on each of the 4 sides, and a number of pieces in the middle that Marguerite just told us about, but I don't remember the number. The shielding, let's talk about shielding, because we saw some, didn't we, recently in Kintail, the Kintail talk, we talked about the shieldings up there, and also we saw them again in Kilmorack, the talk, on the other side of the same piece of summer grazing. It's a word that's a bit confusing, actually, because it's used in 2 different ways, shielding. I do tend to think of it myself as being more about the summer pastures. We take them up to our summer shieldings up there on the hillside. It's more talking about the grass, really, than the buildings. But also it's used in another sense of being the buildings themselves. The shieldings are the huts that people lived in. It's thought of as a very joyful time. Imagine you're in the very north of Scotland there. Days are short during the winter, dark, the electric light doesn't work anymore. You've got to get out and do a little bit of work in the few hours of daylight that you have in winter. So then and you've got your animals living with you in the same building, smelling, that's if you can smell it over the smell of the burning peat. And so it's a great thing to be then heading off to the summer fields, the summer pastures or the shieldings with other families, or the other, if you're a kid, it's a terrific time. You're released to go and play in the summer fields and sit outside and tell stories. It's still light at midnight in the peak of summer. And so the mood of going off to these shieldings is a terrific thing, and a bit the same bit of excitement too when they leave, even to flit back to their winter homes. So usually the women and children will go off to the shieldings with their cattle, going at cattle pace, to feed them on the summer pastures that are too boggy or too snowed in the winter. Mainly though, so that the grass can grow on the fields near where they live in the winter, so that they'll have winter feed for their animals. You know, won't be trampled by cattle hooves while it's shooting in the spring. So this is a typical building, you know, that would have been covered there in the middle with a turf roof to keep and you just scramble in and sleep there if you don't sleep out in the open. Mind you, the midges would have driven you inside in most parts of Scotland that I know. This one is up in the Laird there. They tended their livestock. Okay, that's all good. Let's talk about the sort of transport they had here. They had no roads at all. Very few carts or wagons, but look at the number of horses they have here. My God, what an amazing number that is, 682 horses, and no carts to be pulled by them. And I'll show you later that there are no ploughs either, but they've nonetheless got 682 horses. That's extraordinary. And 73 boats is quite a lot for, you know, a couple of thousand people in the parish. So the answer is that most people used boats or walked to get to anywhere. Mind you, I doubt they went very many places farther away. They might have gone to Barvis, but, you know, as for going to Stornoway, it would have been a big deal to head over to Stornoway through those bleak moors in the middle. Transport, no carts, no ploughs. Remember that. Fishing is, of course, a thing that everybody can do. And you've got to get this feeling that this is a place where there was very little specialisation. Most people could build their own houses, grow their own crops. The women could do the spinning and the weaving. Men could do weaving as well. People could probably make their own shoes, as we've seen many times before in these sessions. So, you know, they were not only self-sufficient as a community, but by and large, they were self-sufficient within a family to be able to do most things they needed for their daily lives. However, to get a little bit of income in, which before the potato arrived, they needed some money to buy grain. They didn't have enough grain produced in the parish, as we've seen often, to sustain the community through the long winter. And so to do that, they would collect herrings. They could salt the herrings because of the generosity of their landlord. Mackenzie of Seaforth is the only laird in this district, the same one who we saw in Loch Alsh and in Brian Castle in near the Black Isle. And so they catch herrings in great quantities, and he says that the minister says that this last few years they've been of uncommonly large size and in great quantities. So it's a good thing. They can sell them, the herrings, or keep some salted for themselves. Although the gales in this recent winter have proved fatal to some of the sailors, some of the fishermen. He says women don't fish, but they row strongly, he says. And he says 40 years ago, the only place they could sell the herrings was to Swedish merchants coming to buy them. Swedish 40 years ago. But now people come from elsewhere to catch and to buy from the locals. Cod is plentiful in the season, which the season is around about the same time over the depths of winter. And we talked about that before. And there are quite a lot of seashell, you know, mussels and oysters and clams and cockles and so on by the seashore that they can supplement their diet with. The dreaded kelp. You remember we've seen kelp when we did the Harris talk. We saw that kelp was a major source of income for the local people. They would go out in the cold water to collect cut the seaweed off the rocks and so on, the seaweed, Kelp refers to not so much the seaweed itself, but to the soda ash that's produced by burning the seaweed, making Na2CO3, for those of you with a chemical bent. And then you have the job of bringing it out of the water, usually in creels, baskets, taking it up to somewhere where they could be burn it. And the burning involved a 24-hour round-the-clock operation, poking with a stick, keeping the fires burning, putting new seaweed on after it had been dried, and keeping it alight. 140 tons is produced annually, he says. And by comparison, in Harris, they produced 450 tons of kelp. So it's not, although it's quite a bit and they'll earn a bit of money from this, it's not as much. It's only about a third of the amount that they produced in the neighbouring parish of Harris, the neighbouring district of Harris. He says that the kelp that they produce, that's the lump of soda ash, is superior to other highland parishes and attracts a guinea more in price than the other parishes get. A guinea, that's just a bit over £1. Yeah, so whatever that is in real money, it's a lot. A guinea, it's just a bit more. I don't know why they use guinea in this context. That photo actually is from the Harris talk. It's a good one to show you the burning of the kelp. And, the thing we saw when we talked about it before was that the kelp operations took away the workers, the people, from planting and growing and tending and weeding and so on their normal crops. So it was a double-sided thing. And the seaweed that they previously had used in their lazy beds to fertilise the crops they were growing was being diverted to making soda ash. Now, soda ash prices were good during the Napoleonic Wars because the normal sources for soda ash were cut off by the wars. They were in Spain and places that could no longer get it from during the Napoleonic Wars. And then after the wars, the industry completely collapsed in Britain because they could go back to the old sources after Waterloo. So this was a big motivation to up stakes and move to Western Ontario. Nothing wrong with that, Barb, is there? Western Ontario. They could do worse. And so looking at the sort of other opportunities for making something they could sell and also for their own house use, you've got quite a lot of, he lists the number of animals they have. And if you add up the cattle, there's quite a lot of cattle, the 2,000 odd, and then you've got also milch cows and calves. So that's another 1.5, so 3,500 odd cows of one sort or another. And sheep, you've got 5,000. There's no talk here about sheep farms, and we know that Mackenzie was not keen on sheep farms and external people and so on. This changed later, but during the time we're talking about, there was no talk about people leaving because of sheep farms arriving. Not mentioned at all. And you got the goats, but then the amazing number of horses, considering there are no wagons. And probably they're the sort of the smallish horses that we've seen before, Garran or whatever they're called. Really, they're doing subsistence farming. This is quite important for you to know that. There are no ploughs. They just use the spade, the traditional Scottish spade. And that's partly because the ground is so rocky that you can't plough it. Just, you've got to poke your spade in that with your foot round any rocks you have. And they go off to the summer pastures, as we've seen in the summertime. Here, this picture shows you some cattle being forced to swim across from an island, probably to the mainland. You see, you've got the stick there poking the cattle in, and you've got the leads here to get them to swim, and then they swim across behind the boat. It's probably a more recent picture, but they did that a lot to get the cattle to where they could sell them to drovers. They probably didn't, none of this involved much going out to places. They were leading a remote, self-sustaining lifestyle, basically. Occasionally ships would come into the lock and they would sell some herrings to them. but they probably wouldn't have a lot of discussion about, you know, what's the latest things going on in downtown Trondheim or downtown Copenhagen. Other things they did, you know, we've seen many times when they refer to industry in this sort of period, they're meaning basically weaving and sewing and, you know, things to do with cloth. They're not talking about making televisions or motor cars. Automobile industry, no. Many of the women could spin. Spinster is a word that comes from that, ladies who spin yarn. We'd use it for another purpose now. Men could make brogues. That's a type of shoe. You know those shoes that you see people wearing at Scottish gatherings and so on that have the markings all over them? The idea is that the water gets out through those holes, not gets in. I don't know quite how, it's not Gore-Tex, you know, we're talking about. The water, that's the idea of the holes, to get the water out. There are a couple of tailors and weavers who live here, but these are the sort of, like there's very little in the way of specialisation. You know, someone who's a tailor could probably also turn his hand to fishing, or her hand, wheelwrights and shipwrights, maybe one or the other. Weavers, there are a few of them, of course, but they'll also be able to build their own home and go fishing if needed, and so on. Net makers, there are a lot, kelp makers, you know, but these are not full-time. Boat carpenter, ship carpenter.
Bruce, there are no masons, given all the stones. They probably didn't need that. They did their own houses.
Yeah, I think that's right. And headstones don't seem to be too popular. And they just, yeah, they put mud between the rocks. They didn't shape them at all, Christine. So here are some of the things that they can earn external income for. Cattle, potash, cured fish, tallow, salted beef, because Mackenzie provides them with the salt. A bit of flax and hemp is made into rope or turned into linen, and some lobster and salmon also exported. He says that only, I think is really the point to make, once a year they go off to Glasgow in two or three open boats to take some of their produce to Glasgow for sale. But, you know, that'd be just a quick trip there and back and wouldn't be like a great education. So really, it's no wonder they have the same traditional practices as they've had for centuries and don't make much change, because they don't have much exposure to the ideas that are coming into it. I'll tell you now that the minister says that he spent, for 15 years almost, he spent trying to persuade them to use this useful root, the potato, after it was brought from South America, from Peru. You know, we've seen how many of them were already well dependent on it in the other parishes, but here it's only in the last 15 years he has been able to demonstrate to them what a useful thing the potato is, and to get them to adopt it, which they've now done with some enthusiasm, and then they don't need to buy as much grain in the winter when they can't produce enough for themselves. I should show you this guy. This is Angus McLennan from Kirkibost. We've seen where Kirkibost is. It's on Great Bernera, and his ID number I190074. And this is his media item. If you go to his page, you know, Angus's page in our clan records, he died in 1932, aged 82 years. And this is his marriage. Angus McLennan, fisherman, bachelor, aged 25, comes from Boster. We know where Boster is now, don't we? Parish of UIG, we know it. The marriage is in the parish of Barvis. So we know where that is. And you got here the names of his parents, his mother, who's deceased by this stage, Anne MacLeod by her maiden name. And there you go. And he's marrying here someone who can only sign by her mark in 1875. And she's from the parish of Locks, which actually is Carloway and Locks. You see that? This is before the Locks no longer is up there in Carloway. Look at that. So we learn a lot from this, and we having that background that we had, and she doesn't know her mother's maiden name. See that? Can you see that or not? Pretty amazing, isn't it? the bride doesn't know her mother's maiden name. And these are the witnesses, MacArthur and MacDonald. So that's a typical document you'll see in the clan records when you go, you look down the bottom of the page, and that's where you see the documents that we've attached and transcribed and put the transcription into the notes and that's him. He's got there a creel. Now there are two types of creels. One of the sort that I talked about before, the big baskets that they throw the seaweed in while they're out cutting it from the rocks and taking it up to the shore. But this sort of creel here is a lobster trap creel. You can see it looks like a lobster trap. They throw it on the ground and catch the lobster. Angus, you know him now, don't you? Clan records, you'll find him there. Now, let's look at the total population. Have I gone over your? No. You tell me if I start your one, Stephen. The population in total, there are about 2,000 souls here, 2,000 odd people. And of those, quite a few are on the young side. Most of them are of the normal sort of working age, 14 to 60. In the green there, slightly more than half. But the younger generation are coming on strong. Look at those that are under 6 here, and those that are from 6 to 13 here. So you've got quite a big percentage here under 13. So really that's a sign the population's growing, and you've got this purple piece there of the pie that's the over 60s. Look at the numbers. We always look, don't we, at the 1755 population, as we're seeing here. And you can see here that in 1755, the Webster census, as it's called, we had 1,300 odd people in the whole parish. And then by 1841, which is a bit after our time, I know. Well, let's look at 1801, of course. Even then, the one we see here, right, 1898, is quite a big increase on the 1,300 that we had in 1755. But look, it continues to grow. So you get up to 2,000 by the 1801 census, and then you've got the 1841 census when there are 3,300 people living in this parish. A huge increase, much more than double, isn't it? So the population's growing, and you've seen those tiny little patches of land and so on that are all they have to grow things on. It's no wonder they up stakes and headed over to lovely Glamis in Western Ontario. Barbara. Yeah,
I've been there many times.
that's it. And the sort of houses they lived in, this is a house that was lived in until 1964, people. I'm talking about how slow they are to change, right? This is a house that was lived in until 1964. Now, some of us were born before 1964. And look at it. No chimney. This is the classic black house, right? No chimney, thatched roof, virtually no windows, one door. It may be they've got another door around the back, but the classic one has only one door for the animals and the people to enter. And the animals go into the downhill side of the building in the winter. They live there all winter. And the humans go into the uphill side so they don't get the sewage draining down from the animals. And it's dark in there, dark inside. Marguerite did do a calculation of how many animals there would be, but we don't think actually all of them lived in there. She just was pulling out the numbers, the raw numbers of the people who lived in the place, and dividing households, the number of households, and put how many animals there would have been. Quite a lot though, even so. Yeah, so she says that on average there'd be 5 people in each house, which, there'd be some with 1 and there'd be some with 8, 10. And for that, each household on average owned 2 milch cows, 5 cattle, 13 sheep, 1 goat and 2 horses. So they wouldn't all be in there, let me tell you that. Certainly the horses wouldn't be, and probably the sheep, and certainly the goats wouldn't be welcome amongst the other animals. So. But even so, there are animals in there. And of course, we know that blood sausage, for example, was a way of taking the blood out of the cattle's neck and making some nutrients for the humans to eat over the winter. This building itself is still there. You can go and see it just north of UIG Parish on the west coast of Lewis, at a place called Arnold. There it is there. It's a museum today. This is what the inside looked like, what life was like in the inside. This is a weaver's cottage. So you can see over here the weaver weaving during the night and lit by the fire. No wonder they made a few mistakes, but not much spotlight going on there, is there? And you got what looks like the granny over here beside the fire with the kids around the fire, and the mother here feeding the baby. And these look like pets of some sort, maybe a dog and a cat perhaps. And look up here, you've got chickens in the rafters. Cozy little setup, isn't it? When you think the cattle and so on are down the other end as well, making whatever noises cattle make in the night. There you go. So this is actually from a weaver's cottage on the Inner Hebrides, but no doubt was similar, and drawn in 1772. And as we saw, this sort of thing goes on into the 1900s, not just in the 1700s. Any questions about that? I might not be able to answer them. What life was like? Probably no candles. And of course, there were no matches at that until quite a bit later, and they evolved and were made better. So you had to keep the fire burning all the time, or go and see your neighbours and get a burning stick to bring home and restart your fire.
Bruce, I have two questions. Sorry about this. What is that?
Okay.
What is that hanging down above
Oh
the
yeah,
fire?
that's the hook that you hang your pot off to put your sort of stew into.
Of course. And is it my recollection that this is the first time we've seen any illustration of domestic dog or cat? I don't think we have.
All right. Yeah, probably. First, yeah.
I mean, it's another mouth view.
I think that's what they are, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
Moggy, you know that English term. And this is what they burnt, right? Peat. And the peat in Lewis are traditionally large like this. And I was asking people from Lewis last night, why? This is much larger than the peats that I know from elsewhere, which are roughly half that size. The Lewis fellow told me this is probably, you know, a much more recent photo than you think. Probably in the 50s, even 1950s. But you know, you can see that, you know, look at the house here. It's not that much different to what we saw a minute ago. You've got a couple of windows. That might be a big improvement. Maybe there's even a chimney, but it's only a, you know, variation on a theme. And these peat, you can see how big they are. And the answer was that in Lewis, two people cut peat at once. You always have the two people working on the peat. One's cutting and one's lifting. And therefore you can lift a bigger peat. So they cut them bigger. And of course they dry there for a while, whatever, depending on the weather, of course. They leave them just by where they've dug them up to dry for a start. And then they take them back, often in packs on the side of a horse or in their own creels, whatever. And there are plenty of it on Lewis, but of course no trees. So that's all you can burn, really, peat. They don't have money to buy anything else. Over to Stephen, what their diet was like.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about food, and I just want to note first that the potato has made its appearance in this parish. In the statistical account, it indicated that 15 years earlier, people would not eat potatoes, but have lately acquired a superior knowledge and practice of the culture of potatoes. And you might have noticed and Bruce pointed out the steep incline of growth, and some of that may have been fueled by potatoes. And in addition to that, they sort of became dependent on potatoes. And in the mid and later 1800s, where you saw a decline in population, they had a number of blights and potato issues, which would have restricted food. And so some of that population could have been tied to, at least in part, some of the potato growth and knowledge and consumption. It's also interesting to note that during the 18th century, distillation of whiskey was very common. And actually the practice of that was maintained up until the point where they had the potato blights, where they then needed the grain for food. And so the arrival of the potato allowed them to use the grains for distillation. But when they had the restriction due to severe potato blight, they were obviously needed other food sources, and they pulled the grains that were being used for whiskey and used them for food. Prior to the potato, kale and cabbage were common, but they were out of practice once the potatoes overcame them. And then, of course, as Bruce had mentioned earlier, there was plenty of seafood and fishing around, which was a predominant source of food. And it's noted again here that the Mr. Mackenzie of Seaforth provided 2 different shelters for them to store salt so that they could salt the herring and other fish, which was very useful to them. Let's go on to the next slide. So there's a little bit of discussion of the health, and one of the things that was noted was that there was only one surgeon on the entire island of Lewis, and so for all of the parishes there in the island, there was only one surgeon. So they would not have been probably looked after very closely due to the large area that the surgeon would have had to cover. As a result, there were a number of health problems that were noted. They're listed here. Rheumatism was very common. Erysipelas, which is basically a skin condition. It's a bacterial infection. It's actually, we know it today as a staph infection, and colic. And that Reverend Monroe spends quite a time talking about this infantile epilepsy, which affects a number of children at birth, some fatally. And it was also interestingly noted that if they lived to the age of 2, then they no longer had these symptoms. And in addition to that, it was only found among people who had resided on the island for a long time, indicating probably that there was a genetic predisposition within that population to an infantile epilepsy.
Someone said last night that it might be lack of vitamin D. Is that possible, do you think?
It's possible, sure. I mean, there was a statement in there saying that people had to have lived there a long time before it happened. And so I'm sure there's sort of a combination of genetic factors, lack of light, but it isn't, there's a lot of other places that have that same lack of light where this wasn't present. So it's probably a lot of factors involved there. And it was noted that boiling water wasn't common, nor was the practice of bathing. And so many of the health conditions were likely associated with infectious diseases, bacterial infections in particular. The Reverend did note that there actually was a number of people that lived for quite some time. There were several people at or over the age of 90. And he also noted that barrenness was scarcely seen and there were no suicides. So In general, they seem to be reasonably healthy, and with some of the diseases that might be expected with the conditions that they lived in.
Thank you, Stephen. There are quite a lot of poor nonetheless, 50 people poor in the wanting alms from the other members of the community. It's a big percentage, isn't it, of 2,000 people? And he says that the money collected for the poor is quite inadequate, very inadequate indeed, for meeting the exigencies of so many paupers. That's a bit of a tragic thing. So, this is another reason why you might up stakes and go somewhere else. Looking at the number of the ministers themselves, we don't know a whole lot about the first one listed there, John McLeod, but we know that Morrison preceded our current minister in 1742. He answered the call to become the minister at that parish, as it's said in the Presbyterian polity. And then our minister, Hugh Munro, became the minister in 1774, so well after Culloden. But he'd been there for quite some years when he wrote the old statistical account around about the mid-1790s. And then he was replaced by Alexander MacLeod, who wrote the new statistical account. We haven't talked much about the new statistical accounts, but that's a whole set of documents that are just like these, with the same sort of questions and answers, and give you a different impression of what life became 40 or so years later. Some are written in the 1840s. And the nicer thing about the new statistical account is they're arranged in area so that you get all the neighbours together rather than just random order as they came in with the old statistical account. This is where the church was there at that place, called Balnarkilly. This church was not built until 1829, after our current period we're looking at, but it was built on the same site over the same foundations as the previous church had been on. And it was for this new minister, the one we saw here coming in 1824. It was built, Then the church that our minister was operating in was built in 1724. And there are foundations of even older churches there to be seen for archaeologists. This is what the church looked like, the one that was built in 1829. You can see here how austere it is, like there's not a lot of pictures on the wall, are there? And the back of it has this double staircase arrangement, a bit unusual, in that you can go up to the gallery upstairs through either of these two staircases. Often the aristocracy would see themselves as more fit for going upstairs than the hoi polloi. You can see here on the plan for that building that there's the two staircases going up to the gallery up above. And this is the downstairs here. It's the same facade we saw a minute ago there. There are just one parochial school, one school, Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge school, and 3 spinning schools. Munro says that there are only 8 people in the parish who read well enough to be able to read the Bible. How amazing is that, huh? And he may be talking about the English Bible, because the New Testament wasn't translated into Gaelic until after this time. So he may be talking about that. But, I think if you're able to read one, you're probably able to read the other. The education would be such. But 8 people only. Perhaps some of those were McLennans, because quite a few of the McLennans here were tacksmen. That means the middle ranked people who own in the sense of having the right to use land that's contracted, and they then sublease it to others sometimes, often. And he says he hopes the English language usage will improve. There's a bit of speculation here about the McLennan teacher that we saw in Locke's parish, who was one of the first teachers in the islands, that he may be related, maybe a son of someone from UIG parish, but it's a bit speculative there, we don't really know. There's this family of McLennans who lived on Great Bernera, and John had arrived there in 1715, a long time ago, And there are some sons, one of whom is called John, and maybe this John who became an early teacher there in Locks Parish, at that place that I find hard to pronounce. Kioso, or whatever it is. People have told me several times how to pronounce it, but I can't remember. In our database, ID number 42363, we have this John McLennan here, who became the taxman in UIG. And the story is that this is the story as told in our clan records, and also it's in the Hebridean Connections collection. And we have a newspaper from 1951 that I currently am transcribing to put this story where it originated from into the records. And he says that on account of his great wisdom, this John McLennan, John was held in high esteem by the then proprietrix, the wife in other words, of Kintail, who lived at Brian Castle. This led to a feeling of jealousy on the proprietor's part. Catherine will like this story. And as a result, he was finally banished to Kirkibost on Bernera and allowed to use the summer grazing on Tolster and giving Little Bernera to, and Koya, that's that place up there at the end of Great Bernera, to his three sons. So this is how John came to be there. He's said to be the first McLennan in this newspaper article from 1951 in the Stornoway newspaper. He said what John is said to be the first McLennan who came there, banished by the proprietor of Brian Castle, the Mackenzie head honcho. This is the route he would have taken to get from over here near the Black Isle at Brian Castle on the Conan River, you remember? To get there if he came across land and then took a boat across the Minch, and then from Stornoway found his way overland, and then another boat to get to Bernera, Great Bernera. Even today on Google Maps it says it takes 5 hours to do it, so it would have been a bit longer in those days. And these are some of his sons. I won't go into detail there, but there's some of the people. Some of the McLennans who lived there. This is the percentage of McLennans that we always look at, the number that were born in our records in the first decade of the 1800s. They are evolving, of course. We will find more people to add to this, but for now, they're not lucky number 13. You can see it's the top of page 2 of this graph. You can get these graphs from the left-hand side of the genealogy page. They're dynamically created, so they're not static. They're just created as you ask them. So be a bit patient while the computer whirs away and finds the answer for you, but that gives you a feel. And you can do it for any decade in those sort of times. And the most popular names, no surprise to anybody, Donald and John are the boys' names, and girls' names, Catherine and Margaret, are the popular ones. There are a lot of folk tales. I think we're running out of time, so I'll just skip over most of this. But, you know, you can imagine people out in those summer pastures at the Shieldings, long nights telling stories about the distant past and who did what and when things happened, and making up some fiction to go with it. And, you know, this is all being told in the Gaelic, which is a language that lends itself to storytelling. People had already started to emigrate from UIG by the time of our statistical account. We know that in 1774, a ship called the Friendship went to Philadelphia. And these are some of the people who were on board. No McLennans, but, you know, there's a Arthur McIver, as they say in Scotland, from UIG. There's an Angus MacLeod from Brenish. There's a John MacLeod from Carloway and his family. And there's a Murdoch Morrison from UIG. So you got quite a few were in the 1770s migration to Philadelphia, of all places. Up here in the north of Great Bernera, there's a place where a migration ship left from, several migration ships. One of them was called the Marquess of Stafford, and it left there in 1851. And there's a rock there that has the date 1851 carved into it. Maybe they waited a long time before the ship to leave, so they had time to fill in. There were a couple of other ships that may have been the ship that they were on, but that's the suspicion that relates to the migration voyage. Just a few McLennans. We're going to quickly skip over these. Malcolm, who married Anne Smith. you can see here that the son of that marriage, also called Malcolm, like his father, died in 1885 in Bruce County in Ontario, in the west of Ontario there. That's the common pattern. You've got Malcolm, another one, marrying Mary Matheson. We know all these people well from our study group, don't we, Kathy? Catherine knows them even better, maybe, than all of us. You know, this is Malcolm, the famous Malcolm. Hooray, Catherine, we like it. Some go to Cape, some are born in Cape Breton. That's a bit unlikely, actually, what we see there. Anyway, and they die in Canada. This is some headstones in burial grounds in Western Ontario. All these McLennans here, Malcolm McLennan, Mary Matheson, the wife, Margaret McLennan here, and Catherine, various headstones. This is a mystery one. Anybody got the answer to this? We'd love to hear. This is a wonderful headstone in the Lewis Cemetery. How about that in Ontario? And it's a Murdoch McLennan, spelled with a K there. McLennan died in 1865. Yeah, must be. And his wife Jessie, we don't know her maiden name. And there's a book about the history of Bruce County, which has Murdoch elder in brackets, McLennan. You know, we don't know whether this means an elder in the church or just as an older one, because there's also a younger one. We're not sure about any of that. So anybody who has a clue about this headstone, Marguerite, Kathy, Catherine, and myself would all like to know.
We will talk about it tomorrow. He was an elder in the church in Ashfield.
Beautiful. Tomorrow. Anybody wants to join us? Anybody wants to join us? Do it. Here's another family. You know, this is a family sort of typical sort of thing. You've got them dying in, you know, parts of Scotland mainly. In fact, there are no Canadian deaths there. This is the sort of thing you see if you haven't used the clan records. Time you did. This is Marguerite is particularly interested in this word here. See, this describes Donald, son of Murdoch. Donald, so it means Murdoch. It means Donald, son of Donald, son of Murdoch, who in turn is the son of Donald, the son of Donald. Right. So she doesn't know though what this last little bit means here. People last night from this part of the world suggested it might mean a place, not so much an occupation or whatever. I won't dwell on that. That's just some questions for discussion if we had it. This is just before we close, a few resources you might like to use. This is a really unusual place where they have these records. It's just, I went there and it's just in the middle of nowhere, this unusual looking building, and they've got the archives there, the Burner Historical Society and UIG Historical Society. And then you've got Hebrides People is a website that's useful. This one here is a recent thing. And when we did the Locks Parish on the other side, the fellow who was really the brainchild behind this thing was at that meeting. He joined us. So go back and have a look at that Locks catch-up video, if you like. And there are a few others there that you might be interested in. You can go view these on the catch-up website. And if you're looking to look for any resources, that's some great ones that Marguerite has found. So really, have we achieved the objectives today? I just wanted to try and summarize a bit what my impression is of what we've seen here today. And that is that this is a parish that has little contact with the outside world. It has had little contact for many centuries with the outside world. And change comes very slowly because of the lack of education, the traditions, the hazards they face, you know, the risks of the weather and people dying at sea and so on. They're very cautious people, although friendly. And so we see change coming slowly. A lot of work needed to convince them about the wonder root the potato. A lot of conviction needed to, you know, help them overcome other resistance to other changes. So they're not people who are going to change very quickly. But in the end, they're forced by circumstance to poverty and whatnot to up stakes and head to a better world somewhere else. So we've looked at the topography and what that does for their life in this part of the world. Some very early, very, very early, the earliest we've looked at in any of these meetings, settlements, because they're so evident here. We've looked at how many people and the growing numbers of population and their living conditions, what sort of opportunities there were for eating, growing or catching food, and industries, things they can sell, something about the schools and the churches and the ministers, and a few McLennans we briefly looked at there in the end. So thank you again for your participation in this meeting here today.